Hi, today's Cinco de Mayo, or as we say, May 5th, and I'm honored to have Dr. Jay Bhattacharya with me. Jay is well known, and so I'm going to let him self-introduce. For those of you who don't know, you'll find out very shortly. Jay, what have you been up to, and what's been the good fight?
Hi, I'm Jay Bhattacharya. I'm a professor in the School of Medicine at Stanford University of Health Policy. I have been, well, as the pandemic comes to a close, I guess today officially the World Health Organization declared the end of it. I've been really interested in two things. One is uh, we have not yet had an honest evaluation of the policy responses to the pandemic. We have a lot of people pat themselves on the back and give themselves awards despite tremendous failure. Millions of people dead from COVID, collateral harm on a scale that's almost unimaginable to especially the poor and children. And so what we need is an honest COVID commission. So because as things stand, if we have another pandemic of a similar kind, we will do the same things again. We will lock down again. We will harm our children. We will do all of these useless things, fearmonger, because the public health leaders have not learned the lessons. So that's the first thing I've been involved with. The second I've been involved with is the way that the government's treated the public sphere. In particular, basic civil rights like the freedom to speak, were governments around the world, including the United States, violated those rights. And so I've been involved with legal cases and advocacy to try to turn that over. As a general matter, that I think is even more important than the pandemic response, because if you don't have the ability to speak during a time when governments are making tremendous mistakes and governments use their power to sort of suppress dissidents, the policy responses end up being much worse. And and of course there's basic fundamental things about not wanting to live in a totalitarian state or whatever that drive me. Both of these things, maybe we can talk about the specifics, but like I've been involved with a number of groups, including things that I've founded to try to address these problems.
I recently saw you on Capitol Hill, and you were there. Could you just describe what that was about, what that was like, with whom you visited, and what were your encounters?
So there was a couple of things. So one was I was there to give testimony to Congress, to the House, which was holding, I guess the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee was holding a hearing on Section 230 reform. So Section 230, for those who don't know, is a law it's called the Communications Decencies Act in the United States. And Section 230 of that law governs how big tech and social media companies are treated. Basically, what it does is it allows social media companies to publish basically almost everything, and not be liable to suits because of defamation or whatnot. The idea being that, well, if Twitter lets me write whatever I want, it's not Twitter's fault. It's a good thing that Twitter allows me to write whatever I want. Mm-hmm. During the pandemic, but the flip side of that is that Twitter can't be a publisher, right? They can't have sort of intrusive editorial positions. They say, okay, you can't, you're allowed to say this, you're not allowed to say that. Well, then they become a traditional publisher subject to normal libel laws and all that. Section 230 exempts them from that, but then they're not allowed to be a publisher. That was the old-fashioned way of thinking about it. That law's been in place since like the mid-90s or something. During the pandemic, what happened was that social media essentially became government censors. It was the sort of the government arm of censorship. They abused that Section 230 protection, in effect, becoming publishers. Maybe we can talk about this in coming in a few moments. But like what I've learned is that they didn't just do that on their own. They were induced to do that by governments. That they used their power over the public square about what can be said and what can't be said in the public square to suppress speech that contradicted government policies regarding COVID, including on school closures, masking, vaccine mandates, vaccine science. They use their power to suppress scientific debate and policy debate in ways that should never be done. And so I was there in Congress to testify about that, and in particular about my experience of how big media treated me, big tech treated me, and also to tell the folks in Congress that it was actually the government that was at the center of that censorship.
Yeah, no, it was by proxy. Right. I mean, the carrier rule is such that AT&T or the successors, they handle your telephone calls, but they can't tell you what to tell your mother, what you shouldn't say, and so forth. I mean, because they're just there as a passive. They're basically the ocean over which your cruiser floats and so forth, and they have no real discretion about which way you want to go when you're on your sailboat or whatever. Or conversely, they are, in which case maybe they're more like a train track, and they get to decide which trains go on, which don't, whether you pass muster as a train carrier. I can't go on a train track. I can't put my car on it, so forth. So there's all kinds of rules. So if you're running the train tracks, it's a closed system, and so the question becomes, which is it? And I think you bring that up. But it's interesting when you said that the tech companies went after you and silenced you, when really they did it by proxy. And that's an interesting aspect because the concept of fascism is from the Roman fascia, which was a part of the symbol of the Senate in ancient Rome, and it was taking a bunch of sheafs of wheat or whatever, and each one individually is weak, but you put them together in a fascia. So we have fasciitis in medicine and so forth, which is a bundle. And so if you get that fascia together, you have strength out of numbers. And the idea was, to get everyone together, we'll be strong. And Mussolini resuscitated that as an Italian to bring up the legacy of Rome. But the real essence of fascism is when you tie together, not the people in this case, but tie together government with corporate structures. It's corporatism, it's cronyism, and it's fascism. And they particularly, so the tech companies went after you, and not only you, but they went after, based at the behest and of certain of people in government. Can you talk about who those were, what their missions were, what are the repercussions and ramifications?
So I don't have a full picture of it, and just to preface this, the picture I do have of it, I've learned from a case called Missouri versus Biden that I'm a party to. I'm represented by the New Civil Liberties Alliance, NCLA. The Missouri versus Biden case was brought by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office against the Biden administration and against I'm just going to call it what I think it ought to be called, the censorship industrial complex of the federal government. Through this case, we've been allowed to depose a dozen high-ranking officials in the Biden administration, working throughout various parts of the federal government, including Tony Fauci, for a long 8-hour deposition, which I'm sure he enjoyed. What we found in this case is that. And we also, through the discovery in this case, we have access to emails that pertain to this censorship effort that the government undertook. So what we found is that federal agencies and federal officials, including into the White House itself, were regularly in contact, not just in contact with, but like embedded within social media companies, Twitter, Facebook, you name it. And they were regularly instructing social media companies the content that they wanted censored, and even often people that they wanted censored and deboosted. So, for instance, I found out when Bari Weiss did her first Twitter files expose that I was put on a trends blacklist when I first joined Twitter in August of 2021. Like, why would I be put? I was a professor of medicine then at Stanford. Why would Twitter put me on a blacklist the day I joined Twitter? It makes no sense unless because they don't want to. I mean, like in their financial interest it's to let people speak, right? Not to suppress speech. Now I don't know this for certain, but it seems quite likely, given what we found in the Missouri versus Biden case, that Twitter didn't just do it on their own. They put me on a blacklist because they were asked to do so by government actors. And we do have, from Missouri versus Biden, many emails where the government actors, including again inside the Biden White House, directly threatening Twitter and Facebook, mainly Facebook, telling them that if they don't comply with the demands for censorship and suppression, then the government would deploy its powers against these companies to essentially crush them using the whatever tools are available inside Section 230 to do that. I mean, they put the big tech companies in a very difficult spot. I mean, maybe they also wanted to cooperate
I
too,
was thinking, oh my God, twist my arm, don't make me, don't make me eat this ice cream. I think they were completely aligned. I think the generations have gone from, I mean, the boomer generation. Maybe I'm a boomer. I think has gone from quote unquote question authority to authority unquestioned, authority aligned to the authorities, becoming authorities.
I mean, the thing is like if let's say just they whatever inherently wanted to suppress dangerous misinformation, which turned out to be actually true in many cases. Suppose they actually wanted to do that. Well, then they would have been subject to legal action by parties that had been suppressed because they violated Section 230. Remember, the deal was that they don't get to serve as publishers. Here you have the government telling them, well, if you don't suppress, we're gonna subject you to Section 230. It's a complete subversion of what that Section 230 protection was supposed to be about. The government and the big tech together work. And you said fast. I mean, I don't like to use the word because it's
an F word. I didn't say anybody committed this. I just said that is the essence of fascism is when the state aligns with their selected corporation.
I think the thing is like, I mean, okay, leave aside the particular word, the kind of power that the government and the way that it used it during the pandemic was entirely inconsistent with the norms of our liberal democracy. We have a First Amendment, and it's not just a legal matter. It's almost like a civic religion that we have a devotion to speech in the United States. It's what sets the United States apart in the minds and eyes of most people of the world, of its like almost fanatical devotion to letting people say what they think. Essentially during the pandemic, the government decided to violate that. Large political parties decided that kind of radical commitment to free speech, which is enshrined in the First Amendment, was no longer needed, was no longer wise, no longer good for people. That is a shocker to me. Like I have, whatever your political opinions. I mean, I've always thought that the great thing about the United States was that we allowed in the public square so many different ideas, so many different people, and that there wasn't this suppression. To see, I mean, especially liberals come out in favor of what effectively is, to me, looks like book burning. I mean, I mean, that's the moral equivalent of it. Like you say, okay, these scientists aren't allowed to talk online because they're too dangerous. I mean, and the funny thing to me about that is like, it's not just that they suppress what's being said, because, that's not actually completely possible in this internet connected world. You can always get something out. The purpose of it was a social credit score, a negative social credit score placed on people that were opposing government scientists, a dissident science. The idea was it's actually kind of almost a Chinese totalitarian principle of putting a negative black mark on the speech and identity of people that disagreed with the government on policy. I mean, and that's just shocking, right? That's something that the government ought not have the power to do, especially in the United States that has this deep commitment to free speech. Requires that the government stay out of that, right? If members of the government, politicians can say, I don't agree with X, Y, or Z, that's fine. But to use the power of government to essentially censor and delegitimize the speech of others and people that do that speech, that's not a power that the American government traditionally has had, nor should it have.
I mean, I'd like to hear more about the lawsuit per se, but you mentioned China, and there is a little bit of a China theme through this last pandemic. I can't think of all the details, maybe where the virus came from, the aggrandizement, kind of the people, quote unquote, dying in the streets, hazmat suits. But moreover, the adoption, in a sense, I think there's politician envy. I think that certain politicians wish they could get things done and wish they had the power of China. I'm doing a piece on Donald McNeil, the erstwhile chief science writer or global health writer at the New York Times, who was in place both for my own particular pandemic of review, the Zika, literally wrote the book on it. But moreover, given I think he was imbued with some power and extra special powers from his successes in promoting that pandemic. There's an article, I think it's in late January, early February 2020, go medieval on it, basically on coronavirus. I don't know if you remember that article, but there is China. I don't know if the words envy or jealousy. I always confuse those two, but you're the debater. You'll straighten me out. Wherein, he wishes and he invokes that we should go medieval on this, which is, basically locked down and so forth. And in researching it, I mean, this is actually in the article, he kind of sees himself as the fulcrum of the center point, and they convene a panel of 8 unnamed public health experts, but he humble brags that one of them is Dr. Fauci. And when he got the word from Dr. Fauci, he went ahead with this article, and they're, endorsing and espousing this going medieval, whatever that is. Doesn't sound good, because I remember those maces and malls and getting hoisted on your own petard and all that kind of stuff from the medieval area, and having to wear a lot of chain metal and so forth. It was not a comfortable time. And so he wants to do that to us.
We were both alive back then, Randall.
As if it were the Black Death. And it wasn't. So the embedded in this, there's a question coming here. So embedded in this question is, conversely, not China, but off the coast of Japan, Yokohama, there was the Diamond Princess, and there was actionable data, there was visible data, there was verifiable / falsifiable data sitting on a boat, almost literally quarantining in the Italian quarente, 40-day sense, not quite biblically in the desert, but about 14 days at least. Off the coast, and people were not dropping like flies. They were not, having hazmat suits and radioactive and so forth. There was not a zombie apocalypse. Yet, this named public health source of Donald McNeil's, Dr. Fauci, mentioned that he knew about it and he was going to watch it. But yet, we all went China on everything. We espoused lockdowns, which were going on in China. It had never been done effectively outside of like Ebola in Sierra Leone in 2013. Their lockdown is not a public health measure; it's a prison measure. And so China, to some extent, I mean, it's opening up maybe, but it's also kind of a zero COVID place at times. It's a prison state at times, and they can go medieval on their people. Why do we have the jealousy for this, or envy? And what were your thoughts about whether China's methodology were favored at the top levels, and were they right?
So first, really quick on Don McNeil, I do remember that article. I remember being absolutely shocked by it, because it represented a sharp departure from traditional pandemic management of respiratory virus. For the last century, we managed respiratory virus pandemics with focused protection, identifying high-risk groups, developing countermeasures like treatments or vaccines as rapidly as possible, but disrupting the rest of society as little as possible, because that causes more harm than good. That was the traditional pandemic plan. That article sent alarm bells up my spine, at least, and I'm sure many other people. And Don McNeil in himself, he was very abusive to people that pushed back against. I remember a clip where my friend David Katz was on CNN with him, and McNeil basically slandered David right on national TV for saying, look, we know a lot about the risk factors of this. It's older people. Why don't we protect older people? This is in like March of 2020. I think the New York Times in particular played quite a malign role in pushing lockdowns early on in the pandemic. And Don McNeil himself, I think, was partly responsible for that. And not just early. I mean, they panic mongered throughout the pandemic. I think they're in part responsible for why schools closed for so long in the United States. Okay, so that's Don McNeil. Then you asked me about like China and the envy for Chinese policy, sort of powers in the United States. That there's direct evidence of that, Randy. So if you look at these FOIA emails from early in the pandemic. So the World Health Organization sent a delegation to China very early in the pandemic. Because remember, China locked down in January of 2020 after being sort of shamed that there was a virus at all going around that was deadly in like December. There was remember that hero doctor that blew the whistle, and then China locked down. And what they conveyed to the world was that lockdown worked, that the virus went away as a consequence of their lockdown. The World Health Organization sent a delegation with Maria Van Kerkhove, who I think is the chief epidemiologist at the World Health Organization then, and in the United States there was a huge push inside the NIH to try to make sure that somebody from the NIH went on that delegation to China. We know this from a whole slew of FOIA emails, Freedom of Information Act emails. In a particular, Tony Fauci played a role in making sure that his aide, Cliff Lane, longtime colleague at NIAID, was on that trip. They wrote a report when they got back, I think in mid-February 2020, in effect saying that what China did worked, that the lockdown in January 2020 had essentially gotten rid of the disease. And Cliff Lane has an email to Maria Van Kerkhove right after that trip where he writes and says, literally that, he says, what looks like what China did worked. We have albeit at great cost, we have very difficult decisions to make that should involve more than just the people in this room. So there was China envy at the highest points of American public health. And the Chinese model of the lockdown played a tremendously influential role in the American response. The idea that the lockdown worked in China was already, you could know that it was wrong, because by that point the disease had already broken out in Italy. The disease had already, there were reports out of Iran. The first reports in the United States were on January 23rd, 2020. The disease was already everywhere. And it was also really clear by that point the disease spreads very rapidly, much more easily than SARS-1, for instance, by breath. Right? There was these reports of like these Chinese these restaurants in China where one person had it on one side of the restaurant, and then from a contact tracing thing, you could tell that there was someone else was sitting on the very other side of the restaurant, and they also got it. So it's spread by air. So you have a very, very highly transmissible disease. It has this age stratification, which you could see from the Diana Princess data in terms of the risk of death. And you could see that it already had spread everywhere from international reports. The lockdown, whatever China did, had already failed, even before they'd started it. So the idea that the lockdowns, to get medieval on it, was the right strategy was not scientifically justifiable at the time. And yet American public health had China envy. No question about it in January, February 2020.
So I'm going to interject something weird. I had this dream decades ago. I was a young man, and there was this huge cube of ice, kind of like this commercial type, and it was sweltering. It was boiling hot day, and I was like a lion tamer, had a chair and a whip, and I was trying to get that. My task was to make that ice not melt in a hot day. And I was doing everything I could to like scare the ice into not melting. And of course, it's Sisyphusian. The ice melted because it was a hot day, so, but I was working like crazy. And I remember getting up, it must've been a hot night or whatever. I get up in this dream, I'm like, washed as if the ice had melted over me. Like, oh my God, what was I doing? What was I thinking? All that work to do nothing. I feel as if, it wasn't, maybe this was not my dream, my nightmare. Maybe, I feel as if this happened. So there's a question there. Maybe, did we act, absurdly?
Yeah, we did. We absolutely did. We forgot ourselves, right? So public health is actually quite important, as you and I both know, right? We have systems in place to contain very deadly diseases and conditions that plague the world: tuberculosis, measles, a very large number of infectious diseases that threaten the human health. Public health decided that we're going to throw away all of those. We stopped giving measles vaccines in the poor parts of the world because we took those. We decided it was more important to take those resources and devote them to COVID. Tuberculosis treatment stopped in India millions of people didn't receive their antibiotics for tuberculosis. Now we're seeing this like massive outbreak, massive increase in sort of harm from tuberculosis. Completely predictable. All of the public health priorities that public health actually do good, so many of them public health just threw aside in its fear over COVID. So yeah, so it would and in terms of like the efficacy of stopping it, it's interesting because like like imagine yourself in 2009, right? You remember back then we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have StreamYard, we had like a Skype or something, right? And you couldn't, I mean, that technology couldn't have sustained people staying at home and not losing their jobs for months and months and months and years. There's no way, right? That was not a good enough technology to do that.
Yeah.
That's why we didn't lock down in 2009. If we'd had that technology, Zoom in part caused the pandemic response.
Yeah,
Like,
I agree. This is not quite the same topic, but I've often heard it said that if there were a bunch of law professors, econ professors, and top and middle management rushing across the Mexican border to take those jobs, that our elites might have a different reaction to the open border. But since it's plumbers, sheetrock, landscapers, and so forth, like meh. We don't really care so much. I think that the Zoom response is because the Zoom class, the elites can get by with it. And oh well, you're the roofer, whatever, you're the restaurateur, I own a couple retail spots, and these are new, what I call new Americans, from Guatemala and the like, and this is their entire livelihood. This is their entire savings, and literally life savings. They've saved and earned and scraped and worked hard, and you know in the heat and all that kind of stuff, in order to make this go. And then no, you have to close this down indefinitely. Nobody's going to come to your restaurant. We're going to treat it all like cooties, which I think is a Black Death plague term, the cooties. I think it actually derives from that. But so is like Ring Around the Rosie, with people dying or something like that, pocket full of posies. Anyway, we have some remnants of the Black Death still, hundreds of years later. I'm not sure we're going to have any Corona words. But this was the same kind of like disdain. It's like, well, it's just the roofers, it's just the delivery people. So for the little people will, carry on. Biden, was talking about, he had his mask on in a speech. I happened to see it just today, a little clip. He was talking about, the pandemic response. He says, I can sit here and not campaign, and being whatever, because of all the Black, people out there, delivering stuff. I don't know why he said Black, but it is kind of the same concept that, they will take care of this. We will be safe. We need to, and it really harkens back, if you want to think back to Black Death, to this kind of stratification where the elites can self-sequester. They can go to country homes. They can go elsewhere, and they can get other people to do their bidding. So, there is seemed to be, and here's a question. My own feeling is that prosperity is essentially the biggest tool of public health. That certainly there's antibiotics and all this kind of stuff, but without prosperity and that has done more to get people away from the conditions of even my youth, when people starved and whatnot, around the world. Having good communication, good trade, and all that kind of stuff. And all this was abandoned. Have we seen the full ramifications of what this will be like in the so-called quote unquote third world, the less well-off world, of the cutting off of trade for those year to year?
I mean, those numbers are already coming in. I mean, so like the World Bank in 2020 estimated there would be 100 million people thrown into poverty as a consequence, dire poverty, less than $2 a day or less of income, as a consequence of the lockdowns. When we talk about supply chain disruptions, for the last 40 years, poor countries have reorganized their economies to fit into the global economy. And what that means is that the structure of work was such that it's a lot. Those poor countries, the production is aligned to what rich countries want. So when the lockdowns happened, the pointy end of that was some guy on the streets of Mumbai selling coconuts to some IT worker. losing his entire life savings in a single day, because his life savings are tied up in the coconuts that he bought, and if he can't sell them, he can't make money to buy coconuts for the next day or to feed his family. 100 million people are thrown into dire poverty. The estimates from the UN World Food Program was something like 130 million people would be thrown into dire food insecurity, meaning you don't know where the next meal is coming from. You go hungry. In March of 2021, the estimate was that 230,000 children had died in South Asia during that past year, mainly because of the economic ramifications of the lockdowns. 230,000 children, and 130 million people thrown into that is not a thing of the past. That is a thing that still happens. Food insecurity is a live problem today around the world, and we basically forgot that. We just decided like we were going to pull up a drawbridge. This is the most classist. The lockdown response is the most classist public policy I've ever seen in my life. I call it trickle down inequality, trickle down epidemiology, right? So I mean, you got the weird idea that if we just protect the laptop class, that everyone will benefit.
Yep.
It is an insane.
Well, if I close my eyes, I don't see them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that there's a secondary aspect. It's both within societies. I mean, I think this is the nature of Brexit, going back a little bit earlier, different problem, different crisis. But a lot of people didn't understand how Brexit could pass. But there were people in Brussels, let's say, pinky out, whatever, sipping tea and eating croissants, and then deciding like how many cows you could have, or whatever, in some little farm, in Northumberland, whatever. People just didn't like that. They roil and they irritate against it. And every now and then, when they can, they give their message. But it was not just within societies, like you mentioned, classist, but it was at a distance as well, because a good swath of Africa, I mean, we didn't hear any kind of COVID news coming out of sub-Saharan Africa for the most part. I mean, there were the strains coming out, South Africa and whatnot, but the death tolls were not there. Maybe it's a younger population. Maybe they're more outdoors. They're not confined as much, to rebreathing their same air. But that they would suffer seemed to be something that is just a total, inconsequential externality, and very much externality, not really part of their purview. It just seems like whatever. Tanzania, the president there, they didn't have much going on with COVID, and he poo-pooed it, and he got kind of like kicked out of the groupings and whatnot. But in a sense, I'm not saying his scientific ideas were correct. He didn't think it was a real thing. But as far as his actions, to use the kind of the Turing test or whatever, he actually performed better than a lot of others who, locked down society as a result of something that was not really affecting Africa. I don't necessarily want to go all global on this, but maybe we can, there is kind of this federalism of countries. Different countries are brought up in different ways. Maybe we can just kind of focus on one in particular, the one that maybe Europeans can relate to more, Sweden, and maybe you can discuss your debate with Professor Sten Vermund.
Sure. So very quickly on Africa, the pandemic response in Africa was devastating. COVID itself, as you said, didn't have a tremendously large number of deaths, in part because I think 3% of the African population is over the age of 65. So a very small fraction of the African population was actually susceptible to a severe reaction to COVID. On the other hand, Uganda, for 2 straight years, they kept their kids out of school. Most of those kids didn't have access to internet or Zoom school. They just lost 2 years of schooling. And 4.5 million of those kids never came back to school. It turns out, again, according to UN estimates, that many of those kids, especially little girls, were sold into sexual slavery or early child marriage. A lot of the little boys were put into child labor. And it's not because the parents don't love their kids. It's because they were put in such dire straits that, less than $2 a day of income, you can't feed your kids. What do? They either die or you do that, or you just think that's almost unthinkable. We put, through our pandemic response, countless poor families into that situation. And if you look at there are a series of videos that for a group that I work with, this charity that I helped found called Collateral Global. It's a UK charity. We've been commissioning videos of what's happened in Africa as a consequence of the pandemic response. It is heartbreaking, Randy. It is absolutely devastating. And furthermore, I'd say it's just immoral. It's the fault of public health for being blind to poverty, blind to what real poverty looks like, that this happened. Now let's turn to Sweden, because I think Sweden is quite an important counterexample to what and also like a thing that shows what might have been. So I debated the head of the former head of Yale Public Health, Stan Verman, who's actually I quite like him. He's a gentleman and a scholar, but he disagrees with me about the necessity of lockdowns.
So one of you should have been banned. If you had a disagreement, one of you should have banned. Would you have banned him?
No, I had two or three debates with him through the pandemic.
I know that is the essence of knowledge. I mean, that is the essence of science. Science is two things. Science is a body of knowledge, and science is the process by which you accumulate that body of knowledge. And you don't do it unless two things are rubbing against each other. You don't have a fire without a match striking something else. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, I that's a nice analogy. I like that. I think I mean, I wish everyone was like Stan Verman. Like, it's fine to disagree. The issue is like, do you want to engage with people that disagree so that you? I mean, I learned stuff from him, and I hope he learned stuff from me. The key issue in our debate was Sweden, and the interpretation of what Sweden did and what it accomplished and what it didn't accomplish. The Swedish response was essentially something like focus protection. Now, in the early days of the Swedish response, they'd failed with focus protection. The Stockholm nursing homes, they did what Andrew Cuomo did. They sent COVID-infected patients back to their nursing homes, and they had a lot of death in those Stockholm nursing homes. But they learned their lesson from that, did much better at protecting nursing homes, developing policies, giving resources to older people in the population so that they could self-isolate when there was times of high spread. They could organize communities to deliver food to older people living alone at home. At the same time, they didn't lock down. They didn't. Now they had recommendations that, like, you shouldn't have mass gatherings when the disease is spreading rapidly. I mean, that's completely reasonable, I think, but they weren't mandates. Right, they were saying, look, and because such a large fraction of Swedish people trust Swedish public health with good reason, because they're trustworthy. They'll tell you when they don't know something, when they do know something. They're not over there to lord it over you. They're there to, like, give you advice. The people listen to them. Now, they didn't emphasize masks. They never closed schools for kids under 16 ever, not even in spring 2020. And study after study showed that Swedish school children didn't lose any learning during the pandemic. They had normal lives, no masks, no social distancing, just childhood. And then as far as like all-cause excess deaths, depending on how you do the counting, it's among the lowest in the world. Certainly lower than much of Europe, including Germany, France, and other places that had draconian lockdowns in many cases. And even compared to their Scandinavian neighbors, they have lower all-cause excess deaths. Well, just so it's clear, all-cause excess deaths is you take the number of people that died in 2015 to 2019, project out based on the age, structure of the population, how many you would have expected if there wasn't a pandemic, compared to how many there were. And the all-cause excess, that's what you just subtract, and that's what all-cause excess death is.
Mm-hmm. I saw that article in The Spectator. Did they close down the schools? My understanding is like for a week or two.
For kids over 16. For under 16, they didn't close schools at all.
So did the teachers drop dead? Were they did they get a zombie apocalypse? Is my favorite term. Did this happen? And why couldn't our teachers? I mean, they are messengers of learning, one assumes. Did they have a block about learning from this? Was it that they were not curious? Was that the information was not there? Was that suppressed? I mean, what is it that people who pride themselves in education did not self-educate?
Well, there was a fantastic article published in the New England Journal of Medicine in summer of 2020 with a preprint that came out before by this man named Jonas Ludvigsson, a Swedish pediatrician. What he found was that while no children died that spring from COVID in Sweden, the death rate or of teachers was lower than the average of other workers in the population from COVID. The teachers were relatively protected by children, in part because kids are not super spreaders of this disease.
No.
So, you have one of these things where like the science is saying one thing and then the entire policy infrastructure of the United States is saying it completely the opposite.